Welcome back to the Ministry Without Hating It podcast, a ministry of Odyssey Haven coaching and counseling dedicated to the pursuit of answering the question, is it possible to do ministry without hating it? We have a theory that it just might be. We are back again for another Soul Check episode. And if this is your first one with us, where have you been? Go back and listen to all the other ones, please. Seriously, we've been doing this for a little bit now, but really these are episodes that are focused on roundtable discussions with ministry leaders and mental health specialists focused on reinforcing the most important part of you, and that is your soul. And so today we get to welcome back. This is the third time, buddy.
Yes, it
welcome
is.
back our friend, fellow pastor, therapist, founder of Church Welco, BrianJames McMahon. Welcome back again.
Thank you so much for having me. I enjoy every one of our conversations, and so I'm looking forward to today's as well.
We do too. We do too. Today we're focusing on the topic of it's imagination building, and
Yes.
Really interesting concept. And it's funny, we were talking before, all three of us, at least in this conversation, I know AJ is watching, but he would also fall into this. We're creatives.
Yes.
Like we think creatively. We have maybe different ways that we do that. But this is something that I know I personally engage frequently. Brenton, you were just talking about how you live in this world. BrianJames, I mean, you said it way more eloquently than both of us could when you talk about imagination building. But for others, that may not be as natural. That may not be something that they do engage, or they may not even work that way. So that said, when you say imagination building, what does that mean to you?
It's referencing the practice of widening what we have the capacity to see and think about and engage. It's expanding our parameters, if you will. And I think you're right to say, like, some people just inherently have like super expansive imaginations and their minds just go crazy. And there's just something about like they popped out of the womb and their brain is imagining and going lots of places. And other people stay much more in the concrete. That they're looking at the literal physical colors and shapes and sizes. And so there's a bit of a misnomer in some ways that like some people engage imagination and some people don't, that really we all engage imagination. We just might use it differently. And some of us get lost in our imaginations, if you will, or live in our imagination spaces. But really the function of imagination is to continue to widen what we have the capacity to engage. So when it comes to imagination building, really it's saying, hey, I think we as the church have a really huge God. And because we have such a huge God, part of our responsibility is to continue to widen how much of God we're able to see, to widen what we have the ability to engage, to continue to push our own parameters around that so that we don't unnecessarily operate within a limited experience that God didn't design us to settle for.
Well, I get a picture as you're just saying that, just like this
There we go.
visual
Look at that.
of like the Shire
Yeah.
and the hobbits that stay inside and they're pushed out to experience things, and it's all differently. And I know I just opened up a whole world to people just by saying that, but there's like a boundary.
Yeah.
And that we come to it and we can stay in our safety of this place, or we can expand and check out other.
Yeah. Well, I think about like, I was never a big video gamer, but I had a lot of friends. So I don't even know the name of the game that I'm thinking about in my head, but I had a bunch of friends who would play like this world building game where like it's a map on a computer, but it's all dark until your person starts to go there and it starts to like bring light. And then you can build a city there and fight wars, and then you expand your territory and bring more light. But until you go into that new territory, it just sits in the shadows.
Yeah. Yeah.
And that's often how I think about our life, that so much of our own existence, it's there. So much of how we understand, like, of who God is there, but it sits in the shadows of places that the imagination hasn't created room for us to operate in. And the imagination is what kind of turns on the lights that gives access to the space. And then we can figure out, what do we do with that? Do we want to go there? Where's danger? What do we want to stay away from? What do we want to lean in towards? But very much, I love the imagery of the Shire and like the old maps in Lord of the Rings. And you can see, right, the different terrain and territories.
Yeah.
So then why do you think our imaginations are limited when it comes to and let's just say this is not someone, this is not a natural thing for me, like we were just talking about. Yeah. But I think maybe even creatively, we can be limited within our imaginations as well, maybe not as opened up as we think. So why do you think we have those blocks or those things that actually get in the way of that expanding?
Yeah. So the thing with human imagination is we actually can only imagine variations of experiences that we've had or things that we've seen. In our imagination, we don't actually create fully new concepts, constructs, entities. Like when you think about like imaginary animals, like that kids will draw and picture, or new films will come out with new creatures. All of those creatures are still made up of components of other things that have already existed. That as we imagine new spaces, so I can take the experience that I have, and I can break that down into components, and I can rearrange those components to create a new imagination, a new entity, but I can only use the components that I have. And oftentimes, I think that there are some of us who start out with fewer components, if you will. And in particular, when I'm thinking relationally and imagination for church, in the kingdom of God, in the wholeness, like even the idea of saying, like, God is my father.
Right.
What does my imagination do with that?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
If all I have known is an abusive father, theoretically, I can conceptualize the possibility that a father might be benevolent, because I've seen it maybe in a movie, or I heard a friend talk about it. In actually being exposed to it in a friend's life or in a movie or in another story begins to move something into my consciousness that I can begin to draw from as I build my imagination. But if I've only had abusive fathers and you've only had abusive fathers, and we're sitting in a space where we say God is our father, none of us are going to imagine that father figure is benevolent and kind and merciful and gracious, because we don't have any exposure to that in our lived experience. And so part of imagination building requires us actually to engage with people who have different experiences than we do. That widens our database, if you will, that widens our resources, because left to what I have, I'm just going to rearrange the parts to create new expressions of what exists. But I'm not going to necessarily be able to create something altogether different than the parts that I currently have. Does that make sense?
Yes. It is a little. So I can maybe hear some. I'm laughing because I can hear maybe the pushback of like, what are you talking about? I came up with this on my own. Or I think of someone like, you've already mentioned Tolkien here, right? So like, he created not just one little story. He created an entire, backstory and history and all of these things, and you're telling me that he took that from whatever kind of a thing. What do you say to that?
So even he created a whole new language,
right? Yeah.
But language is just a different way of arranging sounds. Writing is just a different way of arranging symbols and lines. So I mean, I theoretically, I guess if we go back, and if someone was holding a more evolutionary framework, that there would have been the first person to draw the first line and the first person to make the first sound. And so if we go back far enough, certainly we get to a spot where this was the first person to make that sound. But also if we believe that God created and designed and humanity was given and we are beings, then God actually created it and birthed it and gave sounds and gave shapes. And even the things that we draw, you can't create a line that isn't some rearrangement of a line that already exists in creation. There's no shapes that we're going to create that aren't some sort of recomposite of elements in the world and this is like God is the ultimate creator. So functionally what we're doing is we're just chronically rearranging variations of what God has created to experience new things and new sounds. And when we put these sounds together, there may be a sound, like a combination that hasn't been combined before. But if we really pull it all down to its most basic form, all of those components already existed.
Sure.
And so when I talk about imagination building, what I'm talking about is we need more components so we can do more rearranging, so we can have more creativity in that, because actually left to ourselves, I am limited to imagining what I have. Now, to the inevitable, inappropriate, and understandable, people are like, I don't know about this. How big is our God? And what I will say that I believe we have a big God who engages with some prophetic imagination. And there are moments where the graciousness of God will place things in our minds, in our lives, that actually we have no framework for.
Sure.
That actually we haven't experienced, and we haven't tapped into, or we haven't seen, or we haven't heard. And actually, because God is so much greater, there are moments where God's divine presence breaks through into our reality and gifts us new components to work with.
Yeah.
I'm grateful for that we're not inherently limited to only what we as humans can develop. And I do think there's a significant responsibility that we as humans play to be participating in cultivating one another's imagination, which is why if I have someone who doesn't know what love is, it isn't enough for me just to say there's a God that loves you. I actually have a responsibility to bring love into their life, to bring that component into their experience. So now they say, oh, here is a construct of love that is different than what I've known before. Now I can take that and I can play with that and I can rearrange that. And now God can expand that. But actually part of imagination building is actually we have a responsibility to each other as part of that process, all held together by the graciousness of God, who intersects and catalyzes and gives gifts that we don't deserve in all of that.
Yeah. That was a good answer. And you may have kept some of the hipsters at bay who are like, what are you talking about? I can be first. I got this.
I am an Enneagram 4. And so accepting that there is nothing new under the sun, that was a hard pill for me to swallow, to say, really, I just create collages of other things and I just call it new art. I'm just rearranging.
See, and I knew that about you, but I didn't want to single it out because I also know that you don't like to be labeled. So as a 4, not you personally, but maybe that is you too as well.
I'm not a big fan of boxes, but also it's not like I'm the first to invent not being in the box, which is its own box and construct. And
That's right. It's like saying we're non-denominational, but that's it's kind of a denomination in some ways. So anyway, that's fun. Fun. Oh, go ahead.
What is there experimentation that plays into the imagination, or what part does experimentation play in this?
Yeah. So 100%. And I think experimentation goes in a couple of different directions. One, sometimes experimentation is pulling things apart.
Yeah.
Right. So if, like the example being, if I was a kid and I had 4 stuffed animals and the animal just is what the animal is, but then I started to rip off this arm and rip off this leg and rip off this head, I am functionally experimenting with what can I do with what I have. And I put this arm on that one, and playing with Legos, like that's the whole entity of it. You initially may get that pre-packaged, pre-structured, follow the steps, build the thing. But then imagination says, how else can I rearrange the elements that I've been given, and what new things emerge in that rearranging? And if we are people who believe that God has given, that God has created, that God has entrusted these things to us, there's some room to say, what does it look like if we rearrange the elements here? And I'm not taking this places where people might be worried that I'd be taking. It's not all.
Sure.
There are danger places and risks, and we want to be attentive and discerning and biblical and consistent with what we understand the truth to be, which is our guidance. But that doesn't mean we don't take some risks in experimenting and exploring to create, because yes, it may open us up to some things that we go, yeah, let's take that one back. That arm does not fit on that body. That shoe does not match that shirt. There are some things that we experiment with and go, ooh, that didn't work.
We're not meant to do that.
We're not meant to do that, so let's not do that. But also in the process of experimenting, reimagining, and rearranging, we go, oh, God is creative. Oh, look at what happens when you put this gift with this gift. Look what happens when you put this spice with this spice. That these two things, look what happens when you put this note with this note, or this color with this color, or this piece of paint with this piece of paper. And look what happens when we put these things together, and the beauty that emerges in that becomes really expansive for us.
I'm curious because this is obviously, we called this a soul check episode. Yeah. We're talking about, we've set this up. How does this play into when we're talking about soul check, and specifically even the life of the leader, and maybe even specifically the ministry leader? Why is this so important when it comes to that?
Well, because this is about imagination, which is about metaphor, and I am a person of metaphor and a world of metaphor. Think about being in the same room with the same air for an extended period of time, and someone opens a window and a new breeze of air comes into that room. That experience, that breath coming in, that freshness that's coming in, does something in our souls. So there's something about the way that we engage our imaginations that allows us to shift our posture differently, to see light falling differently. Like if the sun stayed in the same fixed position permanently, and then suddenly it just shifted a little bit and all of the shadows dance differently. We actually have a visceral physical reaction to visual shifts and changes. We have a physical, visceral reaction to senses shifting and changing, to smells shifting and changing, to feeling different fabrics, different temperatures. That actually, the way that God has designed our bodies is in such an interconnected thing that actually it is in moments of shifting and changing that elicits new experiences that actually we might say actually brings refreshment to our souls. It doesn't mean that every change refreshes the soul.
Right.
That there are some changes that undermine and hurt. But there's something about saying, I've known God and I've seen God, or I've been married a long time, and there are moments where actually I see my wife in a different way that I hadn't seen before. And she becomes more expansive. She becomes a bigger human. There's something of new beauty and new life that actually creates more space for there to be more love. Mm-hmm. And so when we think about expanding the imagination in its relationship to our soul, that if I want to be filled by the love of God, that I can only be filled to the degree that I have the imagination to be filled.
That's good. Yeah.
As you were talking about just like reframing things that we already have into new frameworks and new understandings, I just see this like we're having this discussion at a worldwide level right now in the talks about AI, where it can't create anything new. It's just taking the frameworks of everything that's been given to it for it to process and putting it back together in a way, based on our prompts and things that we give it. I don't know the question that's on the other end of this is but essentially we're just at this point smarter than AI, but we're doing the same things and we're trying to train other things to do what we were created to do in being imaginative and creative and finding new ways to be.
The parallel that you're highlighting, I think, is really fair. And I mean, the conversation around AI can go so many places. But this particular subset that you're naming is right now, the limitation of AI is limited based upon the prompt that it is given.
Yeah.
And that if I only have 3 prompts and I can only give AI 3 prompts, it's going to be limited in what it can give me back. Mm-hmm. When my imagination of what to ask, of what to look at, of what direction to lean into is limited, what my opportunity to experience in return is going to be limited. When my imagination of what I can ask God and how I can see God and how I can engage God is limited, if I come from a construct where we don't sing songs and music is not part of how I experience God, it is only text and it is only written text, that is going to elicit a different relationship with God than what happens when I add music to it. Wow. What happens when someone actually introduces the possibility that God created nature, and being in nature actually may bring us into the presence of God in a different way that draws something out from us. And so part of the expanding of the imagination is actually giving ourselves permission for some different prompts. God doesn't change. right? God does not change, but God is huge and enormous. The questions that we ask, the prompts that we use, they do shift and adjust over time. And this again brings us back into the necessity of actually our communal participation in expanding imagination. Then I know, Chad, I could see you're like, how are we going to get practical with this? What are we going to do with this, right?
Well, yeah, that was kind of my next, like to move within that of the, we're talking about cultivating, we've set up in the importance of, so what does that mean? Because once again, three different creative minds and three different creative directions, and maybe even how we engage that. But what are some things cultivating that to keep in mind, practicalities?
Yes.
Or not.
So I think this is one of the reasons that we need to be attentive to be engaging people who are different than us. People who come from different cultures, people who speak different languages, people who have different lived experiences, people who see the world differently, not because we're trying to form agreement, not because we're trying to create consensus, not because we're trying to redefine who God is, but if you're asking different questions than I am, if you have different prompts than I have, if you have a different vantage point, that allows me to actually bring something new, a new data set, a new way of looking, a new component into my world that expands my imagination. And in that expanded imagination, it creates room for me to encounter God more deeply, more richly, more beautifully than I've ever encountered God before. And so I think from a practical standpoint, I think we need to be really attentive to what do our relationships look like?
Yeah.
Because if my relationships are with people who look and talk and think like me, my imagination won't be able to expand because there's not going to be other information components that are also divinely given and created and placed for me to utilize and access. And so for us as single, it is critical that we do the work that we can do to be around people who are different. It doesn't mean that I'm bringing your imagination in or your questions because that's what I want to orient my life around. But it's about expanding our imagination so that God can meet us deeply and more richly and more expansively and shift and change things within us as a result of that.
That's good.
Mm-hmm.
So yet again, another reason why we need community and why we need co-creation. I think that's a word we would all agree with within that as well, because it doesn't just enrich the group; it enriches us as individuals. Is what you're saying.
Yeah, and I think for ministers in particular, right? I think as all of us are pastors, we've all been engaged in ministry in a local congregation. One of the challenges is our worlds actually get really small.
Yeah. Yeah.
Right. We're tethered to a single congregation, which is beautiful. And we give our lives to it and we commit and we care. But that creates a small world, a beautiful world, but a small world. And it becomes challenging to find opportunities to engage with other pastors, to visit other contexts, to see things being done differently. Or we might expand, but we may sit with people within our same denominational affiliations or our own streams of the Christian tradition that still limits our imagination. And I'm not saying we need to alter who we are, right? Or alter the fundamentals of what makes us who we are, or abandon our tradition and the people that we walk with. But there's something that happens when as a Pentecostal, I go sit in an Anglican church and experience an Anglican service, of how different that is, that brings some places where I'm like, that's different. Yeah. And there's places where difference is like, because my brain does this like cognitive dissonance thing. And if it's not familiar, it just assumes it's bad. Mm-hmm. And so I have to kind of ride that wave out to say, okay, my brain is just saying it's unfamiliar. Okay, take a breath. Also notice what's here. Notice the differences that are there. Look at it to say, what does this mean? And in experiencing that, now I actually have a wider data set. I may still, at the end of the day, come back and go, no, I love how we do church. Yeah. I just love how we do it. Doesn't mean I need to change anything, but my understanding of the ways that God meets people has now grown.
Yeah, that's good. That's good. You had mentioned earlier, when we were talking about this, that there are some risks and things that can actually come from cultivating imaginations. What are those? Are the ones maybe you think of specifically, or the things that you hear in pushback when it goes imagination building? I don't know about that.
Yes. So I think there's two risks that come to mind. initially that actually maybe center around the same thing as I'm thinking about it inside my head. So I'll say this out loud and we'll see if this makes sense. And
okay.
I may revise this as we go. This is the, I heard someone say the other day that there are some people who are think to talkers and some people that are talk to thinkers.
Yep.
I certainly lean more on the side of like the talk to think. And so I may talk and go like, nope, now I'm hearing that. Let me rearrange that. Yep. So it's just a caveat to this. But one of the risks is to think that what we are imagining is the literal thing, is actually trying to turn imagination concrete.
Okay.
So an explicit visceral example that I will give this is coming from like the therapeutic clinical side, right? One of the places of imagination that gets really scary for people is when people are experiencing intrusive thoughts, particularly if they're intrusive thoughts about harm to self or harm to someone else, right? Someone starts saying, hey, I have this thought that's happening, and we start to freak out and go, does that mean you're going to end your life? Does that mean you're going to hurt someone else? What do we need to do? We step into crisis management mode because we immediately assume that the imagined thing is a real thing.
Yeah.
Or is a concrete thing and is a practical thing. And I'm not saying we don't need to be concerned, that we actually have a whole process of assessing what the risk level is and where do we need to intervene. But when we so quickly rush to the conclusion that the thing being imagined is going to become concrete, we actually miss how imagination, the symbolism in imagination is its own language. Right. So using this metaphor as an example, that I sit with a lot of clients who sit with places of deep pain and end up in moments where suicide is being contemplated or harm is being imagined in these experiences. And one of the questions that we ask in imagination building ways is to say, what is that image trying to communicate? What's the message in this that is being sent to us? Because it isn't just the thing, it's about what the thing means and what is being communicated. And oftentimes intensity of imagery is communicating, this is how deeply I am hurting. That the image isn't about what I want to do, but is trying to get our attention, that this is the depth of the experience that I'm feeling. And so when we too quickly assume that the things we're imagining are meant to be concrete or are concrete or will become concrete, we don't give ourselves time to actually draw from the symbolic side of the imagination that actually can be really significant. And so I use that as like a really visceral, painful example.
Yeah.
Right. I sit with people who sometimes in that intensity is like, I want to, or you've probably never said this, but there are moments where I've sat in my living room after a really bad day and I was like, I want to throat punch life in the face. I just want to throat punch him, knock him in the face. I just want to throat punch life.
I've never said it that way.
I was going to say, I've never put those words together in that.
In the visual, right? There's a visual. I want to just take all of my life, put it in one big entity, and I just want to throat punch it. Just want to knock it out. In what am I saying? I want to blow up my life and end my relationship and walk away from kids? No, not at all. But I'm using images that I have to try to compile them in a way that reflects something that is being experienced. Mm-hmm. So were I to limit myself to say, oh, that imagery, that's too intense and that's too violent, I'm not allowed to even think those things. What I'm left with is just a really intense emotional experience that has nowhere to go and no way to be expressed. So we've talked about how imagery, like expanding imagination, gives more room for us to experience God. But expanding our imagination also gives more permission for us to be honest about what our own experiences are.
Yeah.
And so there is a risk to assume that what is imagined immediately becomes concrete. So I think that is a risk. I also think the other part of that is to assume that all imagination is useful, or maybe to put in the Apostle Paul's language, that all imagination would be beneficial. Mm-hmm, right? So it's all permissible. It's not all beneficial.
Right.
And do I still hold agency, or am I being mastered and controlled and dictated by the thing that's being imagined? Like
in terms of like fantasy, I would assume you're talking about. Yeah.
Yeah, because that's another great example of imagination. And I mean, I come from part of my own story, and my context is coming out of like problematic sexual behaviors and the way that particularly men and porn and fantasy and the way that plays in. And so there's this almost immediate goal, like I need to stop fantasizing, like cut off fantasy, just stop thinking about those things. And the difficulty is that robs us of the opportunity to say, I wonder why you're fantasizing about the things that you're fantasizing. because
interesting.
in sexual addiction recovery, like rarely is it actually about sex. It's about something else that sex represents, that sex is a symbol for, is a metaphor for, that I have unmet needs that I'm being met in this way. I have a pursuit of power or needing to be taken care of. And all of those places of fantasy are actually symbols for something actually very non-sexual, but deep within us. And so when we immediately just knock off the fantasy, also what I'm saying is we're just not even going to pay attention to the need that you have that's being expressed and visualized, because I have a problem with the imagery that you're using in your imagination. So let's shut that down, not recognizing that actually I'm shutting myself down and just bottling things up. But the flip side of that is we're not saying, hey, just go imagine anything and fantasize about everything, that it doesn't make that fantasy good. It doesn't make that fantasy beneficial. We just want to be attentive to how quickly we're shutting things down. And then also going, if I'm not allowed to use fantasy in that way, am I allowed to use fantasy in other ways? That is all fantasy bad? And now we're starting to go like, imagination is dangerous. Let's not imagine. Let's stay within really narrow frameworks and going, but maybe I meet God by sitting and imagining being on the top of a mountain and having the wind wrap itself around me. That also is fantasy.
Yeah. That's good. That's good. We had a nice little sidebar here. And one of the thoughts was, what the heck just happened here? Right.
Yeah.
And so if that's you, we don't know. We're going to have BrianJames tell us. So, but in all seriousness, it's an abstract thing.
Yes.
And I know it's not going to catch everybody. And if you're still with us, thank you for sticking around. Pass this along to your friends, but help us maybe land the plane within that, BrianJames.
Yeah. Because I think what Brenton just named was part of what we just did was engage in a conversation that was a practice of imagination building, right? We took this concept of imagination building and we just kind of tossed it up and we stretched it. And I brought in my vantage point around it, which may be different than other people's vantage point. And so I would just name that the purpose even of having this conversation isn't to determine or limit how do we define imagination building, what is the two things that imagination building is supposed to be, but actually to participate in engaging in a conversation that may create some room for some different things, right? The number of different ways that we've talked about things, I could imagine how various people hearing it coming from different contexts, there's going to be some parts where some of the things we talked about may sit really far outside what they've considered or conceptualized or thought about before. For some, it may be super encouraging and permission giving to say, oh, like there is some room and I can do that. And for some of us, it creates panic and going, are we saying everyone needs to deconstruct and rearrange everything? And like that feels really dangerous and risky to do that. And so I think that experience that we're having, even in this conversation of going, what is happening, is the practice of imagination building. And so for those who have been a part of the conversation, I would just say, well done. Sit through, take from this what is useful, allow yourself to be challenged by things that maybe don't sit quite fully. I'm not sitting here as an oracle of the divine, declaring and determining what is. It's participating in conversations with people who may be a little bit different than us, maybe a lot different than us, to say, how do you see the world? How does that create more room in me for me to see God more fully, for me to see myself more fully, for me to see those around me more fully? But I do think that question is for like, what was this and what just happened? And I think the answer is we just wrestled with some things that expanded our imagination. Yeah. Maybe in some ways we agree with, maybe in some ways we're like, yeah, I'll dial that back and we'll go there next time.
Well, and I would just maybe to add to that, I think, and you had said this earlier, and it is a question that actually does do it. It expands the imagination, but it also can be very practical and just saying, why do I feel that way? Or where's that coming from? Or, it allows you to actually imagine, even if it is abstract, or maybe it is just black and white. No, this is based on rooted in pain from a past experience or something. That's still engaging and cultivating, embracing imagination building. Yes. And so it's not as scary as people might think.
No. And I would just encourage that we have an incredible God, like an incredibly huge God. And I don't want anyone to feel like they are stuck with just like a little fraction of the greatness of who our God is. And I'm not saying that everything is God and everything is true. I'm just saying God is bigger than me and God is bigger than you. And because God is bigger, I want to take some risk to say, what is it about God that I don't yet know? And I'm not even going to be able to know the right prompts. I'm not even going to know the right question if it's left to what I already know. So I need to be around you. We need to be engaging in conversations to say, what are the questions about God that I haven't even had permission or known to ask that unlock and expand God to me and my own understanding of self? And I think that's a really significant practice.
Yeah. Yes, 100%.
Yeah, I just, maybe to add some more language to this, a sense of curiosity, a sense of adventure, a sense of that what do I not know that there is to be known, and like allowing ourselves to dig and seek.
Stay curious. That's a big deal. It's a real big deal. That's good.
It's like the Dos Equis guy, stay thirsty, my friends, except for it's stay curious, my friends.
That's right. That's right. That feels like a way you could like start to end your podcast. Stay curious, my friends.
Stay curious, my friend.
That might get cut. We'll see. I don't know. We'll see.
Yeah.
I think one just caveat I want to make just to this whole conversation, as we're talking about imagination building, I want to make sure that we're not portraying it in a way that says those who aren't intuitively, naturally imaginative are somehow like problematic or there's something wrong with that. Actually, I think part of the beauty of how God has created humanity is there are some that just, their imaginations will just go and go and go and go and incorporate new things and expand what they can imagine. And it just continues to go to the expansive. And there are some people who are like, do not push me anywhere beyond where I am right now. And I want to stay right here. And I actually would just say, I think we need each other.
Yeah.
Well, part of the risk in imagination is that we would go so far into the imagination-dated spaces that we would actually lose our tethering to the ground, into relationships, into people, into the concrete. So we need some people who are just going to tether there, who keep pulling us back. And in the same way, part of those of us who maybe lean more naturally into large imagination spaces, part of the gift that we have is to continue to help others expand in spaces they might not naturally. So I just want to put that caveat in. We need each other. It isn't one over the other, but I do think that for us as followers of Jesus, there's a real particular value in the care of our souls, of being able to continually widen our own imagination of God, of creation, of one another, and of ourselves.
When we were also sidebarring about this from a teaching standpoint, and I think of even Jesus and how he was able to teach on the broad spectrum to those who did think abstractly, right? We have parables within that. And then you've got those that he was very clear and very direct. And even in our communication styles, as you know, for preachers, teachers, pastors, whatever you want to, whatever you fit under within that, is that is a big part of what you do as a teacher, is to take sometimes abstract or maybe even things that are hard to visualize as you're reading in scripture and make it plain and simple and equip people with that. And so that's also engaging the imagination and building out, because how can I actually take this and present this to somebody in a way that they can understand and it becomes tangible to them?
Yes. Oh, 100%.
It's like the Lord just gave us all these different types of gifts and plopped them all down, and we get to open them up and they're differently. And,
yes. And part of that imagination building is learning to see them all as gifts.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's good.
That becomes part of it, which is why we need to be with people who have different gifts, just like with different cultures and different languages and different ways of seeing. That being with people who are differently built and wired and gifted and experienced actually expands the whole.
Well, BrianJames, thank you so much again for your time. Anytime you're on, it truly is, it's a gift. And so we want to say thank you for that.
Oh, you are so welcome. I look forward to more conversations. I think if there are ways that I can be helpful to those that are listening, you can always reach out through the website, churchwell.co.
That's good.
And we got individual support. We got community support. We've got trainings that we do and facilitate. And so any chance to help participate in the expanding of imagination, I am game for.
So once again, thank you for listening. If you'd like to connect with Brian James or Church Wilco, we will make the ways to do so available in the show notes. And if you want to connect with us, if you have a question or if you have an idea of something else that you'd love for us to unpack even further in one of the Soul Check or one of the Shop Talk episodes, you can reach out to us, withouthatingit.com. Thanks again for listening, and we'll see you next time.